And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. Joining me tonight from Duff Hart Davis to the programme. Good evening, Duff.
Hello, good evening.
Now, the book that Duff has written is called The War That Never Was. It's subtitled The True Story of the Men Who Fought Britain's Most Secret Battle. Just tell us a little bit about the subject matter of the book, just as an introduction.
Well, it was a covert war in the Yemen in the 1960s, and it went on for 5 years. And we, the Brits, had people in there, but the government kept denying that we had anybody, and it was an extraordinary private army. It started and run by a man called Colonel Jim Johnson, who had been in the SAS, but no longer was. And he organised mercenaries to go out, not very many, but it was very effectively done. And they went up into the mountains of the Yemen to sustain the royalist faction. There'd been a revolution in 1962, which was precipitated by President Nasser of Egypt. And the Imam, the priest king, had been driven out of his palace and taken refuge in the mountains. And in came the Egyptian army with tanks, artillery and everything, and a great many soldiers, and tried to take over the whole country. But the royalists were in the fantastic mountains in the middle of the country. I mean, really, I haven't seen them myself, but photographs you can see the amazing mountains going up to 12,000 feet. They'd got ensconced there, and the Egyptians couldn't get them out. And our guys were up there training them, showing them how to lay mines, and doing medical work, because they had no medical facilities whatever. It was a fantastically primitive country. There was only one known medical treatment. That was called wusam, which is branding with a red-hot iron. And even if you had a headache or something wrong with your eye, they would still brand you on the stomach, thinking that drove out the evil, whatever it was.
I'm sure it did, and many other things too. Fascinating timing, though, for the book, because you must have thought, well, all your Christmases had come at once, with the Yemen being in the news, Egypt being in the news, and you published the book at exactly the right time.
Yes, that's a tremendous fluke, of course, and the whole Middle East going up in flames. But I guess the situation in the centre of Yemen hasn't changed very much in these totally inaccessible mountains. And what goes on there, you can't really tell, even with drones and things going overhead. It must be very difficult. And in the days I'm talking about, 50 years ago, there were pretty well no roads. Everything was either on foot or by camel. So communications were very primitive, until our guys started putting in a radio network, and that was the other thing they did.
Now, tell me how you came to write the book, because that's quite an interesting story in itself.
Well, through Peter de la Billière, the general, I got to know Jim Johnson, the instigator of the private army, and he always wanted the book written. And he asked me first if I'd do it in 2006, but he decided it was still too early for security reasons, because people are still very sensitive about it. So we waited until 2008, and then I had a long chat with him and with his number two, who second in command during the operation, Tony Boyle, who'd been an Royal Air Force pilot. And we'd agreed that Tony was really the man to write the book, because he'd been in the Yemen, seen the whole thing, and he could write a bit. And I said, well, I'll dot the I's and cross the T's if you need a bit of professional help. So he started doing research among survivors, and then, alas, he dropped dead on his laptop. And so his sister was left with all the papers, and she asked me if I'd take over. That was how I came to it.
So it's taken, what, three years to put together?
Couple of years, yes.
Now, let's go back to 1962. Just take us through exactly how the war came about.
Well, this revolution was engineered by Nasser, who was really hoping to take over the whole of Arabia. I mean, he was a very ambitious, aggressive fellow. What he wanted to do was to get control of the peninsula, take control of Saudi, and then he would be strong enough to have a go at his bitter enemy, Israel. That was his aim. So he engineered the revolution. In came the Egyptian army. Away went the royalists into the hills. And for the next 4.5 years, awful fighting went on, and 20,000 Egyptians were killed. Quite a great many of the Yemenis as well, of course, went under. Very bloody fighting, mining all the roads. When our chaps got there, the traditional method of attack was to rush forward with your jambia, or curved dagger, and just try and cut the head off anybody you met. But we trained them to be a bit more organised than that. But it was a very sporadic war. It flared up here, flared up there, went down again. There was a truce, and then they came back. Terrific bribery, because the whole thing was being paid for by the Saudi government. It was in their interest to keep Nasser occupied. So they were pouring gold in, literally gold sovereigns, minted in Beirut, and carrying the head of King George V on them. It was another one of these extraordinary anomalies. Didn't seem to worry the wild Yemenis. So gold was coming in huge quantities, and people were being bribed and paid with it. And also Maria Theresa silver dollars. And they were lovely big coins, about sort of 2 inches across, and with an effigy of the Empress Maria Theresa on them. And you could tell how much the coin was worth exactly by the amount that the bosom of the lady had been worn by use. If it was very scratched and worn away, then it was worth less.
Nothing worse than a scratched bosom, I always think. Now, what about the British involvement here? How many mercenaries were involved, and how did they become to get involved?
Well, Jim recruited them. He had extraordinary methods of recruiting. I mean, he just one time he was in a train and he saw a likely-looking young man. So when the young man went out in the corridor, he followed him, and the chap thought he was being propositioned, which he was, but not for what he was afraid of. And Jim literally accosted people like that, and some he knew already, and just suggested that for patriotic reasons they should go out. So he was sending them out, and they were being well paid with the Saudi money. And there were never more than 12 in the country at any one time. By the end, he had about 40 on his books, but no more than a dozen. And Nasser became so irritated that he put it around that there were 500 of them. I mean, I think he really thought there were, because they were being very effective. But about a dozen were doing a good job at keeping the royalists going.
And how much did the British government know about this?
Very hard to tell. They pretended they knew nothing. And Sir Alec Douglas-Home, the Prime Minister, twice denied in the Commons that we had anybody there. And he denied that the Imam, the ruler, had asked for help. Well, I've seen the letter in which he asked for help, because I got all the papers of the organisation which Jim had kept. So there were the Prime Minister was skating on very thin ice indeed. And the government never admitted we had anybody there, and they told the Americans we didn't. But it was sort of fairly well known, I think, not officially, but unofficially. But
that couldn't happen nowadays, could it? With the 24-hour news media, the transparency sort of that there is all over the world now, you couldn't keep this sort of thing hidden.
No, I don't think you could. I think that's right. And I mean, satellites would see things going on, which you couldn't conceal, and far higher rate of communication all around.
What was the ethics of being a mercenary?
They were told they weren't ready to go out to fight, but then one of them, Duncan Pearson, was briefed and said, "You're not going to fight, but if you find yourself leading a patrol in the mountains, you will lead it and carry on." So they were perfectly prepared to shoot people if they had to. And the first one of all, Johnny Cooper, was a very bloodthirsty guy, and I don't know how many wogs, as he called them, he blew up. I mean, he was very good with mines. The ethics were that some of the people were definitely patriotic. They wanted to slow Nasser down, or try and stop him taking over the Yemen, taking over Aden, our colony. But some just went for the money, because they were being paid, say, £300 a month, which you have to multiply by about 12 or 15 to get today's value. So £3,000 or £4,000 a month was much more than they were going to get.
And what was the background? What was their background? Ex-SAS?
They were almost all ex-SAS, and this is what made the rumour get about that it was an SAS operation. But it certainly wasn't. It never was that. Not paid for by the government, not organised by the regiment.
And how long were they generally there?
Well, they went for 6 months at a time, and some of them did 3 or 4 tours. I mean, they kept going back because they enjoyed it. There's one chap called David Bailey, who was a bachelor. Well, most of them were. But every time he came back to London, he found he had £1,200, like sort of 10,000 now. So he sort of went berserk in the nightclubs and had a wonderful time.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Duff Hart Davis is with me. He's the author of The War That Never Was, the true story of the men who fought Britain's most secret battle. It's a book published by Century. It's in hardback, and it's $14.99. And it's taught me a lot, because I was vaguely aware that there was something happened in Yemen in the early 60s, but I wasn't quite sure what. Well, I certainly know now. You're listening to the LBC Book Club, and let me tell you who's going to be appearing on the book club over the next few weeks. Stephanie Powers, remember her from Heart to Heart? She'll be on the 11th of April. Peter Mandelson will be joining us. Paddy Ashdown, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, former UK ambassador to Moscow. And next week, we've got Toby Harnden from the Daily Telegraph. He's written a book called Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards in Afghanistan. So that's next week here on the LBC Book Club. Now, at 9:30, I'll be meeting another author, Bill Brown, who's written a book called I'll Tell Your Mother. He's just waiting outside the studio at the moment. But with me for the next few minutes to continue our discussion about his book is Duff Hart Davis, who's written The War That Never Was, the true story of the men who fought Britain's most secret battle. And it's all about what happened in the Yemen in the early 1960s. Now, Duff, tell us about the role that Israel played in this dispute.
That was extremely unexpected and dangerous and strange altogether, in that the Israelis suddenly said they would like to intervene in this war between two Arab nations. And it was funny that we accepted help, because if it had become known that the Israelis were involved, the Saudis would have cut off their supply of money, which was keeping the whole thing going. In any case, Tony Boyle, whom I mentioned, the number 2, former RAF pilot, fixed up the most amazing airlift, whereby they flew arms and ammunition into the Yemen mountains at night with a converted airliner, which was some feat, because there were no recognition devices on the ground. There are absolutely no electronic communications, and obviously the pilot was used to having everything tickety-boo for landing and everything. He wasn't landing, he was just going to parachute the stuff, but he was coming in on a bearing at night to a rendezvous that had been described to him on a rather rickety wireless system. Possibility the Egyptian anti-aircraft gunners would have a go at him. And there was nothing on the ground to tell him where to go, except at the last minute, a little paraffin bonfire burning amid the rocks, 7,000 feet up the mountains. And they told him where all the high peaks were round about, but he had to be very, very careful. And I got hold of this chap called Arieh Oz. He's still around, and he described it as one of the most dangerous things he'd ever done, although he was a regular Israeli Air Force pilot. And he flew, I think, 12 of the 14 missions with a great many rifles, machine guns, bombs, mortars, a terrific amount of ammunition, dropping from low altitude, about 500 feet over these mountain plateaus, and the Arabs waiting underneath, swooping on the stuff. And the great thing was it was getting straight to the Royalist forces, whereas if stuff came up from the south coast on camels, half of it was pinched on the way or looted or lost. So these Israeli airdrops were absolutely crucial to the whole thing.
Because the supply line in any war is almost as important as the battles themselves, because if you can't supply the troops, they're not going to be able to function.
That's right. And camel was a lot of the transport, very, very slow, coming up from Behan, which is the next state to the south, or coming in from the north. And the camel could do about 20 miles a day on the flat, and he could only carry about 300 pounds. And, of course, they were very susceptible to Egyptian air attacks. They were being bombed and strafed by MiGs and Aleutians the whole time, and some of the attacks were with gas. And a lot of people were killed in the mountain villages. The Egyptians said, of course, it had been a sudden attack of smallpox that had killed 250 people in one morning. But we got bodies back and specimens from the bodies and sent them to Porton Down. And no verdict ever came out. I think it was hushed up. But there was no doubt that poison gas was being used.
And what about the living conditions for the mercenaries?
They were pretty horrible. They lived in caves, most of them. And what had happened was all the inhabitants of the villages took to caves during the day. They might sleep in their houses, but they'd get out before first light because of the bombing. But the mercenaries slept in caves, which were absolutely alive with fleas and scorpions. And they had disgusting food, most of which was the stuff called hubs, which is unleavened bread which the Arabs baked by slapping handfuls of it onto the outside of old heated oil drums. Imagine how hygienic that was.
I think I'd want more than £300 a month to live like that. Now, Nasser said that Yemen was his Vietnam. How accurate was that, do you think?
Well, it was an exaggeration, of course, but I mean, he did lose 20,000 dead, and he thought it was going to be a piece of cake. I think he was going to walk it over. So it was a very nasty shock to him, and it went on, and he kept saying he was going to pull out and making a little pull out and then coming back, and it frustrated the whole of his grand design for Arabia. That was the point of it. And
in a nutshell, how did a small group of Britons manage to take on the mighty force of the Egyptian army?
Well, they kept above them, literally. They encouraged the Republicans to stay up in the hills, in the mountains. The Egyptians were mostly from the Nile Delta, so they weren't used to climbing hills. In fact, they couldn't really climb very much at all. And they wanted to keep their tanks and everything down below. So the whole thing was for the royalists to stay high and to make guerrilla attacks and not to have all-out attacks on towns. Our chaps kept telling them not to have set-piece attacks because they wouldn't take the town. And in the end, they more or less paid attention to this and did really what we told them, to keep sniping and blowing up and knocking off the odd one here and there.
Are there any parallels between what's going on today in the Middle East than what went on then?
I don't think so, really. I don't think, as you said, you couldn't have a private army operating to this degree. And how it carried on, I don't really know. But no one tried to stop Jim Johnson running it. And Harold Wilson came to power with the Labour government in '64, and that you would have thought might have closed it down, but not at all. He acquiesced as well. And he just thought it was useful to keep Nasser occupied as much as he could.
And what do you make of the events, particularly in Yemen at the moment? Have you been to Yemen?
No, I would love to have gone, but I think, especially now the book's come out, I wouldn't.
You'd be a brave man to go now.
I wouldn't last very long. I'd be ought to be kidnapped, I should think.
Because it is one of the most despotic regimes in the area.
Yes, obviously, I think it's probably for the high jump, like the other ones. But I don't know whether the regime's ever had control of the interior, because the terrain is just the same as it always was. It's very, very precipitous mountains.
And what are you working on next?
Completely different. It's the life of a naval officer who was swept into the Navy when he was only 15, because the First World War broke out when he was 15, and suddenly he was a midshipman. And within 3 weeks, 13 of the boys with him at school had been drowned, sunk by German submarines. He was called Alan Hilgarth, and he went on to become the consul general in Mallorca during the Spanish Civil War, in which he kept the two sides apart. And then he became the naval attaché in Madrid in the Second World War. And he played a very important part there because he stopped Spain going over to the Germans, almost single-handed. He was very influential. And he was very much tied up in that marvellous spy case, Operation Mincemeat.
I saw a programme about that the other day.
Right, in which they floated a body ashore. Yeah. And he was the man who persuaded the Germans that these documents were genuine. So that was one of his most important thing he did. But an interesting character.
Well, I hope you'll come back and tell us about it. When will that come out?
Gosh, I don't know. Couple of years, I suppose.
Well, it's been a delight talking to you, Duff. Just to let you know the details of Duff's book, it's called The War That Never Was, The True Story of the Men Who Fought Britain's Most Secret Battle. It's published by Century, and it's a mere $14.99. I thought it would be much more expensive. It's quite a chunky book. So thank you ever so much for coming into the studio. Now,